They thought they could beat up the newcomer with impunity, but they didn't know who they were messing with. Write in the comments from where you watch this video, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new stories. The moving truck rumbled down the quiet streets of Willow Creek, its tires crunching over the gravel driveway of a house that looked almost identical to the others on the block. The neighborhood was orderly, well-maintained, and eerily quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew each other and where strangers stood out immediately. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and autumn leaves, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the neatly lined houses. Jamal sat in the back seat of his mother's car, watching as the movers began unloading their belongings. His mother, Sharon, turned to him with a hopeful smile. "This is a fresh start, Jamal. A good school, a safe place. It'll be different this time." Jamal didn't say anything. He had heard those words before. Every time they moved, every time they packed up and left another city behind, his mother said the same thing. But different never lasted long. He stepped out of the car, adjusting the strap of his backpack, and took in his new home. The house was decent, with a well-kept front yard and a small porch, but something about the neighborhood felt off. As he looked around, he noticed the subtle stares from the windows of nearby houses. Curtains shifted slightly as people inside peered out, watching him and his mother with expressions that were difficult to read. "Come on, help me with these boxes," his mother said, breaking his thoughts. He sighed and grabbed a box from the truck, following her inside. The interior of the house was bare, just freshly painted walls and wooden floors that still smelled of varnish. The movers worked quickly, placing furniture in their assigned spots while his mother directed them with the efficiency of someone who had done this too many times. By the time they finished, the sun was setting and the air had turned cool. Jamal sat on his bed, staring at the ceiling, mentally preparing himself for the next day. New town, new school, same old routine. The morning came too quickly. He woke to the sound of his mother calling him from the kitchen. He got dressed in dark jeans and a plain hoodie, keeping it simple. He wasn't interested in making an impression, just in getting through the day. When they arrived at Willow Creek High, the first thing he noticed was how uniform it looked. The building was clean, almost too clean, with pristine hallways and students who all seemed to know each other. As soon as he stepped inside, conversation slowed, heads turned. He walked past a group of students who whispered to each other as he passed. His first class was English. The teacher, a woman in her late 40s with glasses perched on the edge of her nose, introduced him to the class without much enthusiasm. "Class, we have a new student joining us today. This is Jamal Washington. Make him feel welcome." There was silence for a moment before students mumbled half-hearted greetings. Jamal nodded in acknowledgement and took a seat in the back of the room, already sensing the invisible wall between him and the rest of the class. As the lesson progressed, he kept to himself, listening but not engaging. It wasn't that he didn't care. He had just learned from experience that blending in was easier than trying to make friends where he wasn't wanted. At lunch, he took his tray and sat at an empty table in the far corner of the cafeteria. He wasn't expecting company, and he didn't get any. The room buzzed with chatter, students sitting in their usual groups. That's when he first noticed the one who seemed to be in charge. Zachary "Zach" Hayes sat at the center table, surrounded by a group of athletic-looking guys who laughed at his jokes and followed his lead. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. His eyes scanned the cafeteria, and when they landed on Jamal, his expression changed. Curiosity, then something else. Jamal had seen that look before. It was a look of someone deciding whether he was a threat or just another easy target. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but the feeling of being watched lingered. As he walked through the hallways, he could feel the eyes on him, students observing him as if trying to figure out what to make of him. He ignored them, keeping his head down, focused on getting through the day. When the final bell rang, he headed toward the exit, relieved to be done. But as he stepped outside, he saw Zach leaning against a car in the parking lot, his friends beside him. He didn't say anything, just smirked as Jamal walked by. Jamal didn't react. He had learned long ago that the worst thing you could do with guys like Zach was give them what they wanted, a reaction. So he kept walking, ignoring the looks, the whispers, the silent challenges. As he walked home, the air was crisp and the sun hung low in the sky, casting golden light over the town. He could already tell that Willow Creek wasn't going to be any different. It didn't matter how nice the houses were or how clean the school looked. Underneath, it was the same as everywhere else. But this time, he wasn't going to play the victim. He wasn't going to let them decide who he was. This time, he was ready. Jamal knew what was coming before it even started. The moment he stepped into Willow Creek High, the atmosphere around him shifted. It was subtle at first, a few sideways glances, some hushed whispers behind his back. He had seen this play out before in other schools. The new kid always got attention, but when that kid looked like him in a place like this, it wasn't just curiosity. It was something else, something heavier, something unspoken. He wasn't just an unfamiliar face. He was an anomaly in their world. And anomalies weren't welcomed. The first few days were filled with those small, almost imperceptible tests. A shove in the crowded hallway that was passed off as an accident. A sudden burst of laughter as he walked by, though he hadn't heard the joke. He didn't need to hear it. He already knew he was the punchline. At lunch, he continued sitting alone. It was easier that way. He didn't bother trying to insert himself into conversations or approach anyone. He had learned long ago that the best way to handle situations like this was to act indifferent. He knew the second he showed frustration, it would be fuel for them. He wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. That was when the real trouble began. Zach and his group, the self-proclaimed kings of Willow Creek High, weren't used to being ignored. They had made a sport out of testing new kids, out of seeing how far they could push someone before they snapped. And Jamal, with his quiet presence and refusal to acknowledge them, was a challenge they couldn't resist. It started small. In the middle of class, he felt something hit the back of his head. A crumpled piece of paper landed on his desk. He didn't react, just unfolded it slowly. Inside, the words were hastily scribbled in pencil. "You lost? This isn't your school." Jamal sighed and set the note aside without responding. That made them more determined. In the hallways he was accidentally bumped into more often. His chair was kicked in class. His name was whispered as he passed by. One morning, he found his locker open, his books thrown carelessly on the ground. He knelt down, calmly gathering his things, while Zach and his friends stood nearby watching with smug amusement. He didn't say anything, didn't look at them. He just picked up his books and walked away. That should have been the end of it, but it only made them bolder. During gym class, they took it further. The class was playing basketball, and Jamal wasn't surprised when Zach was the first to pick teams. It was clear he wanted to make a statement. Jamal was picked last, which he expected. What he didn't expect was how obvious they would make it. "Guess we'll take him," Zach said, as if it were a burden. The game started, and at first it was normal. Then the fouls started. An elbow to his ribs when he went for a rebound. A foot that somehow always found its way into his path. A pass that was just a little too hard, aimed straight for his face. Each time, Jamal kept his cool. He played, he endured, and he refused to react. But then came the final play. The ball bounced off the rim and Jamal jumped to grab it. Before his feet even touched the ground, he felt it. A sudden, sharp shove from behind. His balance broke and he hit the gym floor hard, his shoulder slamming into the polished wood with a painful crack. Laughter erupted from Zach's side of the court. "Whoops," Zach said, smirking. Jamal clenched his jaw. He knew this game. He knew they were waiting for him to lose control, to lash out. He took a slow breath, stood up, and dusted himself off. Without a word, he walked off the court. That silence did something to them. They didn't expect it. They wanted anger, wanted a fight. Instead, he gave them nothing. After class, he sat in the locker room, rolling his shoulder, testing for pain. He was fine. He had taken worse hits before, but he wasn't blind. He knew this wasn't over. He could feel the tension tightening around him, the invisible weight of their expectations. When he stepped outside after school, the air was cool, the sun dipping low behind the trees. He started down the sidewalk toward home, but before he even reached the corner, he heard footsteps behind him. He didn't need to turn around. He already knew who it was. "Hey, new kid?" Zach's voice carried through the empty street. "Where are you headed?" Jamal didn't stop walking. "We thought we'd give you a proper welcome." Another voice chimed in. The footsteps quickened. They were closing in. Jamal sighed. He had been hoping to avoid this, but it was inevitable. He wasn't scared. He had never been scared of guys like Zach. He stopped walking and slowly turned around. Zach stood in the center, arms crossed, flanked by his usual group. 5 of them in total. They weren't smiling this time. This wasn't just about making fun of him anymore. This was about control, about proving a point. Jamal met Zach's eyes, his expression unreadable. Zach smirked. "Not much of a talker, huh?" One of the guys, Mason, a broad-shouldered brute of a kid, took a step forward. "That's fine," he said, cracking his knuckles. "We don't need words." Jamal's eyes flickered between them, assessing, calculating. He had spent years training, years learning when to fight and when to walk away. He knew what he could do, and he knew they weren't ready for it. But not yet. Not tonight. So he did what they least expected. He shook his head, turned his back to them, and walked away. There was a moment of hesitation before he heard Zach's voice again, sharper this time. "Hey, I'm talking to you." Jamal kept walking. He could hear them debating, the frustration rising in their voices, but none of them made a move. They weren't ready, but he knew they wouldn't let this go. He knew this was only the beginning. Jamal knew that walking away had only bought him time. It had been a test, a way for Zach and his crew to gauge him, to see how much of a threat he was. By refusing to react, he had thrown them off balance. But they weren't going to let it go. If anything, his indifference had made things worse. The next day, the tension in the air was thicker. It was in the way people looked at him, the way conversations quieted when he passed. Rumors had started spreading, and while he hadn't done anything, that was exactly what made them talk. Some students admired his composure. Others saw it as weakness. And Zach and his crew, they took it as a challenge. Jamal walked into school prepared. He wasn't looking for trouble, but he wasn't going to be caught off guard either. He kept his head high, shoulders relaxed, posture neutral. He had learned long ago that body language mattered as much as words. If you looked like an easy target, people would treat you like one. His first class was uneventful, but by the time lunch rolled around, he felt the shift. The cafeteria was always loud, filled with overlapping voices, the occasional burst of laughter, the clatter of trays and chairs scraping against tile. Today, though, he could feel eyes on him. As he walked past Zach's table, he caught the smirk on Zach's face, the quiet exchange of glances between him and his friends. They were planning something. He didn't know what yet, but he knew it was coming. He sat alone as usual, eating in silence. Halfway through his meal, he felt the presence before he heard the voice. "Hey, new kid." Jamal didn't look up right away. He finished chewing, placed his fork down, and finally lifted his eyes to meet Zach's. He was standing across from him, tray in hand, his usual entourage behind him. The rest of the cafeteria had quieted slightly, people turning to watch. "You always eat alone?" Zach asked, tilting his head slightly. "Kinda sad, don't you think?" Jamal didn't answer. Zach's smirk widened. He set his tray down on the table, leaning slightly over it. "See, thing is, we got a tradition around here. New kid's supposed to, show some respect, prove he fits in. You haven't really done that." Jamal remained still. "Don't get me wrong, man," Zach continued, his tone mockingly friendly. "We're just trying to help you out. Make sure you don't stand out too much. It's not good for you, sticking out like that." Jamal let the silence stretch before finally speaking, his voice calm. "I don't need your help." A few people nearby inhaled sharply, sensing the challenge. Zach's smirk faltered for just a second before he recovered. He let out a short laugh and shook his head. All right, he said, raising his hands, "just trying to be friendly." Then, with a deliberate movement, he grabbed Jamal's tray and flipped it, sending food splattering across the table and onto Jamal's lap. The cafeteria erupted in laughter. Jamal didn't move. Zach leaned in slightly, voice low so only Jamal could hear. "What? Nothing? Gonna sit there like a little Jamal stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. The laughter died down. Zach's grin returned, but there was tension in his stance. He had expected an outburst, maybe even a swing, but Jamal just looked at him, eyes steady, jaw set. Without a word, he turned and walked out of the cafeteria. Behind him, the laughter restarted, Zach and his friends high-fiving, reveling in their perceived victory. Jamal ignored it. He went straight to the restroom, cleaned up, and forced himself to take slow, steady breaths. His fists ached to clench, his muscles tensed with restrained anger. He knew what they wanted. They wanted him to lose control, to lash out so they could turn it around on him. But he wasn't going to play their game. Not yet. That night, after finishing his homework, he went down to the basement. His father had set up a small training area there years ago. A punching bag hung from the ceiling, slightly worn from years of use. Jamal wrapped his hands, tightened the tape around his knuckles, and started hitting the bag. Slow at first, then faster, harder. He worked until sweat dripped down his face, until his breathing was heavy, until the anger had drained out of him. The next morning, he was ready for whatever came next. As he walked into school, a few students glanced at him with something that almost resembled respect. He had walked away from Zach's stunt without giving him the reaction he wanted. That alone had shifted the dynamic. But Zach wasn't done. By midday, Jamal's locker had been broken into. His books were torn, his notebook shredded. The inside was smeared with something disgusting, the unmistakable stench of garbage and spoiled milk filling the air. Jamal stared at it for a long moment. jaw tight. Laughter drifted down the hallway. When he turned, he saw Zach and his friends watching from a distance, pretending to be engaged in conversation, but their amusement was obvious. Jamal exhaled slowly. He started cleaning up. Some students walked by, watching, but no one helped. No one said anything. A few looked uncomfortable, but they kept moving. By the time he finished, the bell had already rung. He was late to class, but he didn't care. That night, he trained harder than before. The next day, the pranks escalated. His chair mysteriously disappeared before class. His name appeared in crude graffiti on the bathroom stalls. Someone accidentally knocked his books out of his hands in the hallway. Still, he didn't react. Then came gym class. The teacher had them running laps outside. It was hot, the sun beating down, making the pavement feel like it was radiating heat. Jamal was focused on his pace, keeping steady when he felt it. A hard shove from behind. His foot caught on the edge of the track, and he barely managed to keep himself from falling face first onto the asphalt. He turned around just in time to see Mason grinning. "Whoops," he said, shrugging. Jamal didn't move. He just looked at Mason, memorizing the way he held himself, the way his weight shifted slightly onto his back foot, already anticipating a fight. Not yet. He turned and kept running. Mason's smirk faded, confused by the lack of reaction. Jamal knew what was coming. He knew they were getting desperate, that they would keep pushing until he finally snapped. That night, as he wrapped his hands again, as his fists pounded against the heavy bag, he knew the moment was coming. And when it did, he would be ready. Jamal had been expecting something bigger. The pranks, the shoves, the stolen books, those were just warm-ups. Zach and his crew wanted to break him, to force him into reacting. The fact that he hadn't given them what they wanted only fueled their frustration. He knew they would eventually take it to the next level. It happened on a crisp morning, the sky clear, the air carrying the scent of fallen leaves. Jamal walked into school like any other day, his head high, his steps measured. The moment he stepped through the doors, he felt a shift in the air. The usual whispers weren't just whispers anymore. There was something sharper behind them, something heavier. Students weren't just glancing at him, they were staring. Some looked uncomfortable, others eager, waiting for his reaction. He kept walking, his jaw tight. He didn't know what had happened yet, but he could feel it coming. Then he saw it. Right there, on the side of the school building, where everyone could see it. Bold, black spray paint stretched across the brick wall, the letters jagged but unmistakable. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. A racial slur, a challenge, a message. His fingers curled into fists. For the first time since arriving at Willow Creek High, his heart pounded with pure, unfiltered rage. He felt it boiling inside him, pressing against his ribs, demanding release. The laughter from Zach's table in the distance confirmed what he already knew. They had done this. They had made it clear that this wasn't just about him being new anymore. It wasn't about schoolyard bullying or some childish attempt at intimidation. This was about something deeper, uglier. This was about putting him in his place. Jamal forced himself to breathe. Teachers were already rushing over, their faces tight with worry. Someone was scrubbing at the paint with a cloth, but it wasn't coming off easily. The principal, a middle-aged man with thinning hair, looked furious, more at the fact that it had been done at all than at what the words actually meant. Students watched, pretending not to be interested, but they were. Zach and his crew sat at their usual table near the cafeteria, pretending to talk about something else. But Jamal could feel their eyes on him. He could see the smug satisfaction written on Zach's face, the way Mason chuckled under his breath. They were waiting for him to snap. Jamal turned away from the wall. He walked past them, ignoring the way their laughter rose slightly as he passed. He kept his breathing steady, kept his hands from shaking, kept moving. The school tried to clean the wall, but the words lingered in faint outlines even after they were scrubbed. The stain remained even when they painted over it. So did the message. Jamal felt it in every step he took through the hallways, in the way people looked at him, in the way some students avoided his gaze while others watched him, waiting. He wasn't stupid. He knew some people agreed with Zach and his crew. Maybe they weren't brave enough to say it out loud, but the silence of the bystanders spoke volumes. That night, when he got home, his mother noticed immediately that something was wrong. She was cooking dinner, stirring something in a pot, when she glanced at him from across the kitchen. "Jamal?" He didn't answer at first. He sat down at the table, staring at his hands. She set down the spoon and wiped her hands on a towel before sitting across from him. "Talk to me." He hesitated. He didn't want to tell her. He didn't want her to worry, to call the school, to make things worse. But when he looked up at her, at the concern in her eyes, he knew she wouldn't let it go. So he told her. Everything. She listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. When he finished, there was a long silence. Then she reached across the table and took his hands in hers. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Jamal swallowed. "It's not your fault." Her grip tightened. "I know you, Jamal. I know how strong you are. But this isn't something you have to handle alone." "I can take care of it," he said. She studied him for a long moment, her lips pressing into a thin line. Then she nodded slowly. "Just promise me one thing." He met her eyes. "Promise me you won't let them decide who you are." Jamal exhaled and nodded. That night, when he went to the basement, he didn't just train. He fought. He pounded the heavy bag until his arms burned, until sweat dripped down his back, until his knuckles ached even through the wraps. He had spent years learning control. He had spent years knowing when to fight and when to walk away. But Zach and his crew had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. And they didn't even know it yet. Jamal woke up the next morning knowing that the balance had shifted. He had seen the worst of what Zach and his crew were willing to do, and he knew they weren't finished. The message on the wall might have been scrubbed away, but the meaning behind it still lingered. The school had tried to act like it never happened, issuing a generic statement about respect and unity. But Jamal wasn't stupid. He knew those words were meant to smooth things over, not fix them. When he walked into school, the energy was different. Conversations paused as he passed, students stealing glances at him, some with guilt, some with amusement, some with open curiosity. He felt their eyes on him, their expectations pressing down like a weight on his shoulders. Would he fight back? Would he retaliate? Or would he keep walking, pretending like none of it mattered? He went through the day as usual, attending classes, keeping to himself, refusing to acknowledge the lingering stares. But the tension was suffocating, like a rope being pulled tighter and tighter. He knew that sooner or later, something would snap. It happened after school. Jamal had barely made it out of the building when he heard footsteps behind him. Slow, deliberate. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The air was crisp, The sky streaked with the orange and purple hues of a setting sun, casting long shadows across the pavement. The parking lot was emptying out, most students heading home, but there were enough people around to notice. Enough to watch, but not interfere. He stopped walking and turned around. Zach stood in the center, Mason at his side, along with 3 others from their group. They weren't laughing this time. There were no smug grins, no taunts disguised as jokes. There was only intent. Jamal didn't say anything. He just watched, his expression unreadable. Zach crossed his arms, tilting his head slightly. "You're a hard guy to get a reaction from." Jamal remained silent. Zach smirked, but there was tension behind it. He wanted control over the situation, but Jamal wasn't giving it to him. Mason cracked his knuckles. "We're getting tired of this game." Jamal didn't respond. Zach exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You know, I don't get you. Most guys, they'd either try to fight back or run. But you just walk around like none of this matters." He stepped forward slightly. "Makes us wonder, what are you hiding?" Jamal's eyes flickered between them, his stance calm, measured. Mason lunged first. Jamal saw it before it even happened. The way Mason shifted his weight forward, the tightening of his shoulders, the slight dip in his knee. Years of training had taught him to recognize the signs of an attack before it even fully formed. In one smooth motion, he twisted out of the way, grabbing Mason's wrist and yanking it forward. Mason's own momentum betrayed him, sending him stumbling past Jamal. Before Mason could recover, Jamal stepped back, putting distance between them. The shift was instant. The onlookers, the students who had been pretending not to watch, were suddenly engaged. A ripple of surprise moved through the small crowd. Zach's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before he masked it with annoyance. Mason turned back, face twisted in anger, but Jamal saw it in his eyes. Doubt. He hadn't expected that. None of them had. Jamal exhaled slowly. "I'm not interested." His voice was calm, firm. That only made them angrier. Zach's jaw tightened. "You think you're better than us?" Jamal didn't answer. He turned and started walking away. Mason wasn't done. He moved again, faster this time, aiming to shove Jamal from behind. Jamal reacted instinctively. He sidestepped, caught Mason's arm, and used his own momentum to twist him forward. Mason's balance broke, and he crashed onto the pavement. This time, there was no mistaking it. The gasps from the small crowd, the way some students instinctively took a step back. Jamal looked down at Mason, then at Zach and the others. "I told you, I'm not interested." Zach's expression was unreadable, but his fists were clenched. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to losing. For the first time, Jamal saw something flicker in Zach's eyes. Not just anger, not just frustration, unease. Jamal turned and walked away. As he left, he could feel the weight of the crowd's gaze on his back. The narrative had changed. He hadn't thrown a punch, hadn't attacked, but he had proven something. He wasn't weak. He wasn't afraid. And that changed everything. The day after the confrontation, the atmosphere at Willow Creek High had shifted. The usual whispers that followed Jamal were louder now, conversations stopping when he walked by, students turning to look at him with something different in their eyes. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was recognition. Rumors spread fast. By the time he arrived at school, everyone seemed to know about what had happened with Mason. Some students whispered about how he had taken Mason down without even trying. Others exaggerated, saying he had humiliated Zach and his entire crew. The truth was simpler. He had defended himself, nothing more. But perception was powerful, and right now, The perception was that Jamal Washington wasn't someone to mess with. Zach and his friends were nowhere to be seen that morning. That was unusual. They had always made their presence known, laughing loudly in the hallways, making sure everyone remembered who was in charge. Now it was as if they were regrouping, deciding on their next move. Jamal knew they weren't done. By lunchtime, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. He sat alone as usual, but this time there was a different energy in the air. Students glanced in his direction more frequently, some of them even nodding slightly in what could have been respect. He ignored it. He didn't come here to make a statement. He just wanted to get through the day. But deep down, he knew that choice had already been taken from him. The real challenge came after school. Jamal usually took the back exit to avoid unnecessary attention, but as soon as he stepped outside, he saw them. Zach, Mason, and 3 others from their crew were standing near the gym, waiting. He sighed. He had expected this. Students had already begun gathering nearby, sensing that something was about to happen. The crowd grew quickly, a ring of spectators forming around the confrontation zone, the space behind the gym where fights happened when there were no teachers around to stop them. Jamal walked toward them, his expression unreadable. He wasn't afraid. Zach stepped forward. His usual smirk was gone. He wasn't joking this time. "You embarrassed us," Zach said, his voice low, controlled. Jamal met his gaze, but didn't answer. Zach exhaled sharply. "You think just because you got lucky once, that means you win?" Jamal looked around at the crowd, then back at Zach. "I don't care about winning," he said finally. Zach's jaw clenched. "Then you won't mind what happens next." Mason moved first, just like last time. But this time he wasn't careless. He had learned. He threw a punch, fast and hard. Jamal dodged, pivoting just enough to let the blow pass by harmlessly. Before Mason could recover, Jamal stepped in, twisting his wrist slightly, redirecting his weight. Mason lost his balance, stumbling forward, but this time he didn't fall. He caught himself and turned quickly, throwing another punch. Jamal blocked it easily, then stepped back, giving him space. The crowd murmured in surprise. Another one of Zach's guys rushed in, trying to catch Jamal off guard. Jamal sidestepped, his movements controlled, efficient. The attacker swung again, wild, desperate. Jamal caught his wrist, twisted sharply, and pushed. The guy hit the ground hard, 2 down. The spectators were no longer just watching, they were invested. Someone in the crowd muttered, "Damn!" Zach's face twisted with frustration. "Get him!" The last 2 guys attacked at the same time. Jamal didn't hesitate. He moved like a trained fighter, not wasting a single movement. He dodged, countered, used their own strength against them. Within moments, both were on the ground, groaning in pain. Now it was just Zach. The crowd fell completely silent. Jamal turned to face him. "Still think you run this place?" Zach clenched his fists, but for the first time Jamal saw hesitation in his stance. The crowd waited. Jamal exhaled and stepped closer. "You're not worth it," he said, and with that, he turned and walked away. The silence behind him lasted only a moment before the students erupted into a mixture of cheers and shocked murmurs. The balance of power in Willow Creek High had just changed. Jamal didn't look back. He didn't need to. He had already won. By the time Jamal walked into school the next morning, the story had spread to every corner of Willow Creek High. The fight behind the gym wasn't just an event. It had become a legend overnight. The whispers followed him down every hallway, conversations pausing when he passed. Some students stared at him in quiet admiration, others with uncertainty. But the most noticeable shift was the absence of Zach and his crew. For the first time since he arrived, the hallways felt different. There was no more forced laughter echoing from Zach's usual spot in the cafeteria. No more accidental shoulder checks in the hallway. No one tried to trip him, steal his books, or scribble insults across his locker. The unspoken rule of the school had changed. Mason and the others had shown up that morning, but they kept their heads down, avoiding eye contact. Mason, usually the loudest in Zach's group, barely muttered a word as he walked past Jamal. He had a slight limp, favoring his right leg. The bruises from the fight were still fresh. He didn't look angry anymore. He just looked defeated. Zach, however, was nowhere to be seen. It was strange, the way silence could feel louder than anything else. Jamal didn't let himself relax just yet. He had been in enough fights to know that some people don't just accept losing. Some hold on to it, let it fester, let it twist them into something worse. His suspicions were confirmed when he saw Mr. Reynolds watching him. The history teacher had always been quiet but observant. He had been teaching at Willow Creek High long enough to know how things worked, how power shifted among students. When their eyes met across the hall, Reynolds gave him a knowing nod and gestured for him to follow. Jamal hesitated, then adjusted the strap of his backpack and walked toward the library, where Reynolds was already waiting. The room was mostly empty, except for a few students flipping through textbooks at the far tables. Reynolds sat down, motioning for Jamal to do the same. "I heard what happened," Reynolds said. Jamal didn't respond. He just watched the older man carefully, waiting to see where this conversation was going. Reynolds studied him for a long moment. "You handled yourself well. Most kids wouldn't have been able to do what you did." Jamal remained silent. He wasn't looking for praise. Reynolds leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the table. "You're disciplined," he continued. "You don't just know how to fight. You know when not to." Jamal's shoulders tensed slightly. The teacher's eyes narrowed slightly. "Where did you learn that?" Jamal hesitated. Then, finally, he said, "My father." Reynolds nodded, as if that confirmed something he had already suspected. "He taught you well." There was a pause. Then, in a quieter voice, Reynolds added, "I looked him up." Jamal's hands clenched under the table. "I wasn't sure at first," Reynolds admitted, "but after what I saw yesterday, it made sense. Your father was a legend, undefeated in his prime. Then he just disappeared." Jamal's jaw tightened. "He left because of me." Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "That so?" Jamal exhaled, leaning back in his chair. He didn't know why he was telling Reynolds this. Maybe because the man already knew enough to put the pieces together. Maybe because he was tired of carrying it alone. He didn't like where the sport was going, Jamal said. Said it wasn't about discipline anymore, just destruction. He walked away before it could change him. Reynolds was quiet for a moment, then nodded. Sounds like a man who knew his limits. Jamal didn't answer. Reynolds tapped the table once. "Listen, kid, I know Zach. I know his father. They don't take losing lightly." Jamal looked up. "You need to be careful," Reynolds warned. "This isn't just about a schoolyard fight anymore." Jamal met his gaze. His expression was unreadable, but inside he already knew. Zach wasn't done, and he had a feeling that whatever came next would be worse. The absence of Zach didn't last long. For 3 days he stayed out of sight, but his presence still loomed over Willow Creek High like a storm waiting to break. The whispers continued, speculation filling the gaps his silence left behind. Some students thought he had given up, that after the fight behind the gym he had finally realized he wasn't invincible. Others weren't so sure. Zach wasn't the type to just disappear. He had spent too long at the top, and guys like him didn't just walk away from a loss. Jamal knew better than to believe it was over. He carried himself the same way he always had, calm and unreadable, but he remained alert. He watched the hallways, listened to the way people talked, tracked the way Mason and the others moved. They still weren't looking at him, still avoiding eye contact, but there was something else now. Guilt, uncertainty, regret. The school felt different in Zach's absence. Without him at the center, the usual hierarchy had started to crack. The students, who had once feared Zach's crew, didn't walk on eggshells anymore. The ones who had been targets of their bullying weren't flinching when someone passed by in the hallway. It wasn't a complete change, but it was a shift, a noticeable one. Jamal wasn't sure if it would last. On the fourth day, he got his answer. It was after school when he heard the footsteps behind him. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Zach stood there, his expression unreadable. He wasn't alone, but this time it wasn't Mason or the others flanking him. He was by himself. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Jamal studied him carefully. There were no bruises on his face, no signs of another fight. He looked the same as always, except for one thing: his stance. He wasn't posturing this time, wasn't standing like he had something to prove. There was tension in his shoulders, but it wasn't aggression. It was something else. "I was out of line," Zach said finally. Jamal didn't answer. He just waited. Zach exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I'm not saying we're going to be friends or anything, but you proved your point." Jamal studied him for a long moment. Zach's jaw tightened slightly, like the words he was forcing out were physically painful. "I don't run this school," he admitted. Jamal nodded once. "Took you long enough to figure that out?" A ghost of a smirk crossed Zach's face before he shook his head. "Yeah, well, guess even I can learn a lesson." He turned without another word, walking away. Jamal watched him go, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this moment. It wasn't an apology. Not really, but it was enough. The next day at school, the tension had finally broken. Mason and the others were still quiet, but it wasn't the same kind of silence. It wasn't fear anymore. It was something closer to understanding. The students who had once followed Zach's lead seemed lost, unsure of what to do now that the balance had shifted. But Jamal didn't care about any of that. He had never wanted to be a hero. He had never wanted to be a leader. He just wanted to live his life. And now, for the first time since he arrived in Willow Creek, he finally could. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Check out more videos on the channel, and if you think someone else would like this, share it with them. Thanks for watching.